Yesterday, AM revealed his 3Waters tirade was the second offence for which he had been told off by government ministers, and now he's gone. National Party leader Christopher Luxon's here this morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good, bad, indifferent? How do you feel?
Oh, look, I mean, the situation's untenable, really, and so I think it's a decision for the minister and the Prime Minister, but it's a similar, it's a breach of the code of conduct, and it's pretty straightforward.
Did he text you?
No, he actually called me. We had a short conversation. He personally apologised. I said, thank you for the call. Suggested that he should stay focused on improving health outcomes for New Zealanders, which have all gone backwards. And that was a very short call. So I appreciated the personal.
So he said, I'm sorry for what I said.
I'm sorry
for causing offence and for apologies for what I said. And I said, look, I appreciate the call. Really, we should focus on outcomes for New Zealanders.
And that was basically it.
Pretty short call.
He didn't say, I think you're wrong on co-governance again?
No, we didn't get into any of that. No, not at all.
All right. He says that you're dog whistling. This is what this is all about.
No.
3Waters. You're dog whistling to racist people.
What this is really about is actually how do we get the right level of water infrastructure in place in New Zealand and do so in a way that is financially sustainable so that future generations actually aren't being lumbered with these big costs and we don't get the services we deserve. So
hang on. Future generations aren't being lumbered with the costs, but isn't their plan debt? And doesn't debt get paid in the future? I thought about this today, actually, and it doesn't come up in this conversation. So and look, I'll make this clear. I don't have a problem with borrowing for infrastructure. I have a problem with the hypocrisy of them criticizing another party the way they're doing it and then doing it in a very similar way. So if you borrow for the infrastructure and you're paying for it for the next 30 years, 50 years, whatever, what happens in 50 years when you need to upgrade the infrastructure? Because you've been paying for the last lot. Do you borrow again? So it's like, do you buy something outright or do you buy it on tick? At the end of buying it on tick, you own it outright. But what happens if that's when you need to upgrade it? It doesn't seem quite as black and white. The model doesn't seem quite as easy. You know what I'm saying?
No, but I mean, who goes out and buys a house cash?
Yeah,
right?
True. Other than Instagram influencers or Mr. Beast. Let's keep going.
How do we get really good water quality standards and how do we get the right investment over the next 30 years?
Agreed.
And that's a problem that New Zealand's had for some time.
So how do we do that?
Yeah, it's not something that your solution actually fixes though, right? You basically said to councils, do something by 2025 or we might do something. Not quite sure what that is yet.
No, what we've really solved for here is...
Okay, now I just encourage you to look for an answer. At any of the times that Mr. Luxon is speaking, try and find an answer that makes sense.
We're making sure that we're going to scrap the 3Waters legislation in those 4 big mega entities. That's job number 1. Job number 2 is to return the assets to local control and ownership.
That's I get that.
But the
big thing is the financing. The biggest thing with this whole issue has been the financing. How do councils actually pay for this very expensive stuff?
And that is exactly the issue that has been in New Zealand for a long time, and we've fixed or solving with our proposal.
Okay, so
what we want to do is we want councils to be able to access what's called long-term debt funding. And the reason is that they actually are going to be paying for these assets a little bit every year over time, and these assets last typically 30 to 50 years. It's no different, say, for you trying to buy a house.
Can we just ask this question as well? Because we use the example of the Waimakariri Mayor last night. When Mr. Luxon says they'll be paying for it a little bit every time, is that $10 million for a population of 28,000 ratepayers? Because that doesn't sound like a little bit over time. That sounds like a lot. That's averaging $350 per ratepayer. That doesn't sound like a little to me. I mean, I guess what I'm wondering is what is a little bit? Because it's not just remember, it's not just $350. It's $350 plus interest. Because if it's debt, that ain't interest free. So would that be considered a little bit, which is what he's just said, minimizing it? Or would most ratepayers think, well, actually my rates are currently $1,000. That's a 35% increase. I'm not that happy about that. But remember, no increases to rates. I forgot.
And you decide I'm going to pay it out of my cash reserves this year, well, you can't do it and you never invest appropriately to get a quality asset. What we're saying is let's give councils access to long-term debt funding, like a 30-year mortgage, so they can actually pay for a 30-year house that they're going to be in. And that's what we know. If councils can get access to that funding, they can actually fund the future investment.
So why can't they do that now?
Because it's actually a lot of the water assets are embedded in the local councils, and councils have what we call debt limits.
Yes.
And the great thing is that having talked to many councils and mayors over the last 2 years, they've proposed solutions. For example, in the Hawke's Bay,
Yeah.
those 4 district councils, Wairoa,
Yeah.
Hawke's Bay, Napier, Central Hawke's Bay, have voluntarily said, we want to come together, keep the assets in local control, form a regional council-controlled organisation, manage those assets jointly, and
See,
that
this is the thing.
entity could now go off and borrow money
Yeah. So on
and
their
pay
own,
consistently over time
Yeah.
to actually
just
get
so
much
we're
better
clear for
assets.
people, on their own, councils wouldn't be able to go out and borrow the money that they need to invest in the water infrastructure to keep it up to 21st century standards. Right? They're going to need to join together to do it. And the problem with your plan is that you're not forcing them to do this. They could have done this already, couldn't they?
There's 2 ways through it. One is that the councils, when they came back with their very thoughtful proposals to Nanaia Mahuta in September last year, many of them actually proposed, look, there are neighbouring councils. It makes sense for us to come together to join these assets.
But what about those who've got the worst infrastructure?
Correct.
Okay. This is the most important part, right?
Yes.
And this is the part where, I'll be honest, Mr. Luxon doesn't actively say, yes, rates will go up. But what Simon Bridges does here is very clever. So let's think about 3 imaginary councils, A, B, and C. Let's say Council A has gold standard infrastructure. Council B has, they get by, they're okay, some upgrades are needed. Council C is shithouse. They've got fully lead pipes, they need everything replaced. When you join these 3 together to lift that debt level to be able to borrow, as Mr. Luxon, what happens to the one where 90% of the money is going to be spent versus the one that's got the gold standard? This is the conversation. And there is not an answer to this. And this is what happens when you don't, and I'm not saying centralizing things is a must do, but when you centralize something, it's like, well, everyone gets what they need. If you start going, well, let's do groups of 3s and 4s and 3s and 2s and 5s and 4s, then in amongst them, it's not centralized. So it's not centralized money. So it's not a government going, do what you need to do. It's local bodies then going, hang on, we've been doing and you've been doing, and then it's all infighting. If you get nothing else from tonight's show other than the desperate need to be a patron, listen to this. This is the most important part of the whole show, I think.
Correct.
Who's going to partner with them?
Yep. So there's,
you don't want to carpool with the guy who's driving a Lada, do you?
No. But I hear the argument and I understand it well. The issue is that then each individual CCO or regional council controlled organisation, there are ways in which you can have differential pricing. If one of the councils, for example, has poor assets and is trying to come into that grouping, there are ways in which you can structure the shareholding and ways.
So how expensive is that going to be for those ratepayers to fork out for?
Well, that's going to be up for each local, council-controlled organisation. This case.
Okay, so here's your problem again, because Neil Holden, the new Police Mayor, has said the problem with politicians, local politicians, and he's one of them, is that no one is willing to increase rates or put expenses on their ratepayers because they won't get re-elected. So if you're saying to them, well, you come from a poor infrastructure area, you're going to have to pay more for your water. They're not going to go for it, are they?
No, look, there are major incentives for actually councils collaborating together so they can access that long-term debt funding.
Yeah, but not if it means paying more, ratepayers paying more for water.
Right.
So there is a lot of incentive, let me be blunt. There is a lot of incentive for well-functioning, wealthy councils to get together, right? Councils that don't need a lot of work on their infrastructure. There is a lot for that, but those that are in desperate need, rural councils, which is why this is fascinating coming from National, who are supposed to be the party of the rural community. But those that are in the rural areas are going to be worse hit. And this conversation goes around in a circle for a bit long. We'll keep going.
Right, but the ratepayers won't pay more for water, because what we're saying is we want to take water services and ring fence them. That's been the problem here in New Zealand, is that actually ratepayers get hit with a water treatment cost, and they end up actually having to pay that out of short-term reserves.
Okay, so let's be clear. So you're saying some bills are going to be higher than others. Different regions are going to have higher bills to fix the water infrastructure because some have looked after them better than others, right? So what happens to those areas, those councils that have got really poor infrastructure? You're saying that they're going to join up to this group with their buddies and not going to have to pay any more for the fact that they have terrible infrastructure that needs fixing.
Yeah, so that's the same. That's called cross subsidisation. That's the issue that we're trying to solve for, which is essentially councils can choose to come together voluntarily and form council-controlled organisations to access long-term debt.
But why would they?
Yes, but many of them, because the access of long-term debt means that they can make consistent investments in those assets in that local region. Then what you've got...
The answer is why would they partner with a council that has bad infrastructure? That's actually the end of that question. Like, I don't know if you could get like an Auckland, Hamilton, Wellington council deciding to come together, even though their boundaries don't connect, like places that are urban. But why would they, keep going, partner with a region that needs a ton more work than yours does? In other words, it has the possibility, let me be honest, it's never going to happen. This is not going to happen. But the plan has the possibility of making the rich richer and the poor poorer. That's actually what this has got a plan to do. It's basically trickle down economics, that the big, wealthy, well-functioning councils with good infrastructure, they'll join up with the little poor ones that are falling out, and it'll flow down to them, and it'll all get sorted out in the wash. That's basically what he's saying.
As other scenarios where there will be councils that actually have managed their assets poorly, and actually in terms of them coming into those CCOs, they'll need to work out the pricing. There's no reason why you can't have differential pricing within 4 district councils if you feel one council's actually not coming with good assets.
So differential pricing means some councils pay more than others.
You might have to have people within a particular council that hasn't managed its assets well, having a slightly higher charge.
Right, which would mean a more expensive cost for ratepayers, wouldn't it?
It would mean that they might pay slightly more, for example, if their council hasn't actually delivered or managed their assets.
But you do realise you're now saying the opposite of what you just said.
No. The reality managed its.
Now, remember, no increases to ratepayers.
People within a particular council that hasn't managed its assets well, having a slightly higher charge.
Right, which would mean a more expensive cost for ratepayers, wouldn't it?
It would mean that they might pay slightly more, for example, if their council hasn't actually delivered or managed their assets.
But you do realise you're now saying the opposite of what you just said.
No. The reality is, what we're doing here is making sure that councils can get access to long-term debt funding and financing. Councils are voluntarily choosing they want to work in many cases in this way. There are big incentives for councils to come together, even councils that have difficult assets or haven't invested in assets. And from a central government point of view, we've got transitional funding to make sure that we can incent some of that too.
All right, I'm sorry.
So, to remind us all about Sunday, to remind us all about the conversation, this is the big release of National's policy, right? The big release. Here's a reminder.
What will your plan do to the cost of water bills and to rates?
Yeah, well, look, we're very clear on this, that our policy position will be cheaper than Labor's mega entity bureaucratic model, which also has complex co-governance. And I think a conga line of consultants and bureaucrats that are lining up and
bureaucrats.
We acknowledge that, pipes and
I think Jessica should ask exactly the same question again, saying it didn't answer it. What do you think, Chewie?
Get him back on.
Yeah, maybe you should just ask exactly the same question, like right now.
Labor need to articulate clearly how they're going to build all these new pipes and culverts without anyone paying for it. And we've been very clear that actually
the question for a second
long-term funding and financing mechanisms to match those long-term assets.
Great. So what will your plan do to the cost of water bills and for rates?
So our view is that it's definitely going to, under our model, rates are not going to increase.
As much?
Are not going to increase in comparison to Labor's 3Waters model and the status quo.
So which is it? Are they not going to increase Saturday morning National Party, or are the poorer communities in New Zealand, I'm using poorer as in they've got poorer infrastructure, are they going to increase somewhat? What are we? Wednesday morning National Party.